Hello, I'm Ronald White, and this is going to be a brief demonstration on Workday integration patterns, specifically Workday integration patterns using SnapLogic. We're going to take a look at RaaS. We're going to take a look at the Workday web services. We're going to cover how to interact with them using SnapLogic. Then we're also going to take a deeper look at the Workday reporting as a service, specifically the calculated fields and the level of efforts involved around that versus comparable transformations in SnapLogic. Now, the first thing we have to understand before we get into these integration patterns is what's actually required if you're going to use middleware. So what you're looking at here is the Workday Web Services directory. There's a couple things to point out. First of all, it's very extensive. And second of all, each one of these services has a corresponding WSDL and an XSD. Now, if you have experience with integration tools, what you're thinking right now is, oh my goodness, I need to download and upload all these WSDLs. I need to maintain all these WSDLs. That's very true for the great majority of tools out there. Fortunately, it's not the case with SnapLogic. So the first thing we're going to want to consider here is staffing. Let's click into staffing. Now, within staffing, we have a plethora of operations. Now, these operations are going to be able to get us what we want, and in this case, we just want job profiles. Be that as it may, there's some limitations with the web services. To start, Workday is not Salesforce. The Salesforce API, in my opinion, is a thing of beauty. Where it really shines is when you get into situations where you need to traverse relationships. Those relationships are defined standard, and they can be traversable, but also you can go and define a relationship, and then that relationship immediately becomes a part of the API, and you can traverse it. That's not the case with Workday. These WSDLs, these web services, are, for all intents and purposes, completely autonomous. So if you have something off of staffing and you want to pull related information off an ancillary object, you are likely not able to do that with the API. As we were talking about the API, let's start there. So here I am in SnapLogic, and let's look at the Workday snaps. Let's pull in a Workday read. And we'll go ahead and configure it. I only have one account defined, so it pulls it in automatically. And here is where we want to define our service. First thing to notice is that SnapLogic actually went out and pulled a list of the different web services that are available. In nowhere did I define a WSDL. So let's continue with that staffing example. And the object is synonymous with the operations that we looked at previously. Now I have my list of operations, and let's just arbitrarily pick one here. We'll pick get workers, we'll save this, we'll close it, and we'll validate it. The validation process actually goes out and returns real data. It's important to note that this is your debugging mechanism. In other tools, there's completely different runtimes for debugging. In some tools, there's less than intuitive setup required even to get to that completely different runtime for debugging. And SnapLogic is just part of the build process. So if I click into this, I'm going to see the payload returned from the workers. And if you've never seen a Workday payload before, this is in fact what they look like. An array within an array within an array. And in fact, in Workday, you would be looking likely at an XML version of this. In SnapLogic, everything is binary JSON, or Go, we're looking at the JSON version of it. But the point here is not to critique the Workday response. The point here is that with a few clicks, I was able to get my workers out of Workday. In a legacy integration tool, I would have had to have imported the WSDL. I would have had to get a session token, for example, before I could even start. And it's even worse with the connectors, because as this payload is so hard to work with, they try to simplify it, and in so doing, they actually put a layer of abstraction above the raw payload. In my experience, it doesn't even get you 60% of the way, and you end up abandoning the connectors almost immediately. Now I'd like to step over here to Workday and revisit something I mentioned at the opening, and that is that concept of traversing relationships being non-existent. So one of the powers of Workday, and one of the ways to get around that, is to use the RaaS reporting as a service. And here I have a custom report that I created, the job profile custom report. Very simple report. It's pulling back the composition grid in the job profile. Surely I can get this from the API. However, if I wanted to add a field, and I wanted to add a field from a different business object, academic level. And then I wanted to further get a field from this academic level object, the grant, for example. This is something that is not possible with the API. So in this situation, it makes sense to use the custom report. But how on earth do I now get this data out of Workday for use in external systems? The mechanism to do that is the RaaS service. On the Advanced tab here, I can actually specify the API version and the namespace. And once those two pieces of information are in place, I can go back to SnapLogic and leverage this report as a service. To get that data from the report out of Workday is considerably easier, in my opinion, than using the API. That's just a simple REST call, and that's what we're using here. We're using the REST GET snap. It's part of the default snap pack. From a settings perspective, we're putting in the URL, which we got from the Workday report, and everything else is defaulted. Now, this specific requirement was to write the data to a flat file. This is a CSV formatter. Everything in here is defaulted. This is the file writer. Everything in here is defaulted, less the file name, which I'm creating dynamically based on the pipeline name, and I'm adding the text to it. The point being here that these were all drag and drops. This took me all of 45 seconds. And even this is drag or drop with the exception of the JSON path. This is not very intuitive until you look at the payload, so let's do that. So why did I need that splitter? Because once again, the Workday payload is arrayed. And in this particular case with the REST service, it's actually much cleaner. But if you look at this, I don't care about the headers, I don't care about the status, I don't care about the entity by itself. Actually, what I really care about is this report entry. This is the data that's coming off my report. That's what the JSON splitter is doing for me here. It's saying, split that JSON at the report entry. And when I do that, I get a nice clean payload, something that can be viewed in a tabular format. Just to be consistent, if we go back to the JSON format, you can see that it was very similar to what we looked at in the previous step. It just split the document at the report entry. And that is all that was required. So let's take a look at the file. In my project, I can see I have a new file that was just created. Let's go ahead and just preview that really quick. And indeed, I have a pipe delimited file. How did I get a pipe delimited file from the CSV? Let's pivot back there quick and have a look. Because I can specify the delimiter in the CSV formatter. A bit of a misnomer. It's not just for CSV. It can be tab, it can be pipe, it can be tildes, it can be anything that you need based on your requirement. So to recap, from a configuration perspective, I added in a URL, I split the payload, I changed the delimiter, and I provided a file name. Even with little experience on the platform, I submit to you that this requirement can be met in less than 5 minutes. Now let's take a look at a little more complicated use case, just an extension of the previous, except this time we're going to look at job requisitions. And this time the requirement is, don't send us everything, send us what's changed. So there's a couple different ways to do that. In Workday, it's not very good with the dates. Now in their defense, they've gotten much better at this, but as you use the API in Workday, what you're going to find is a lot of times there is no date by which you can do your traditional incremental logic. One of the things that SnapLogic allows you to use in that situation is a diff snap. So let me show you how this works. I have a report as a service that's getting my job requisitions, the splitter, and then I have my existing job requisitions. I'm just faking this out. This is just me creating a JSON payload that has all the job requisitions that exist in Workday, plus a couple additional ones. Let's take a look into this diff. This is one of my favorite snaps because it's such a common use case and it's very uncommon for integration tools to have this. But it's very simple. What I'm saying is that the sort path is the reference ID, its sort is ascending, and based on that, produce my diffs. I have insertions, deletions, modified, and unmodified. I will hover over, you can see here's my deletions, my insertions, my modified, and my unmodified. In this scenario, I'm interested in the insertion, so I've attached a mapper here. And let's dig into this a little bit, but first let's get some data to look at. I'll validate. And here you can see that the pipeline has finished. If I take a look into this mapper, what SnapLogic is telling me is that there are now 4 different requisitions. And just for completeness, it also tracks what hasn't changed. Useful in some contexts, to be sure. And before we get into what exactly this mapper is doing, I'd like to take a moment to review the concept of calculated fields in Workday and how you can meet those transformation requirements in SnapLogic. And back in Workday, I have the job requisitions report, which was the source for the previous pipeline. And let's go ahead and take a closer look at this. We'll go ahead and edit it. And we see this alert. This alert is telling me that there's a calculated field that's not on the report. Let's go ahead and take a look at these calculated fields. So there's a lot here. That's the first thing that we should notice. Now the error was complaining about calc status. So let's take a look at this report and we can better understand what that calculated field is trying to do. The calculated field, if you recall, is calc status. Now if we look at this report, there is in fact a status, job recruiting status. And what we noticed when we looked at this data is that some of these positions are open, and unfortunately the organization's been recruiting for them for over 8 years. Clearly, we could have a manual effort whereby the good folks at HR go in and clean up their data. But for demo purposes, what we're going to do is we're going to create a status based on these requisitions that have these very old recruiting dates. Let's take a look into these. Text status. The status that's in the report is actually the related object, which is fine for reporting purposes, but it is not sufficient when you need to run calculations based on it. You actually need the hard status, which is what this is doing. It's doing a lookup to a related object and is pulling back the actual value. Let's look at is old and open. This is a Boolean field that's taking a look at the age of the rec and the status. If you're older than 1 year and your status is open, we're going to flip this is old to true. Closed status is a text constant with the word closed. In Workday, you cannot simply type closed as a default. You have to define the calculated field and then use that as the default. We'll save this for last because that is in fact the final product. Job rec age. We've seen that I was using this in a previous calculated field. In fact, I had to calculate it. I had to take the recruiting start date and the current effective date and return the number of days. Text status formatted. What we're doing here is we're taking the text status, which we got from that related object, and we're using the proper case format to be consistent with the other format statuses that we have in Workday and what we want to see in our external system. And then finally, I can use the calc status. And what I'm saying here is that if it's old and open, return the closed status, and by default, return the proper case formatted status of the existing record. We'll add this down here. And again, all of these are required for our simple calc status, which is what we want. We'll go ahead and pull this through. Click OK. And I'll run this. And what we'll see is we now have a calculated status that mimics the rec status, except for the case when there are very old requisitions. In that case, it flips it to closed. And now we'll go ahead and take a look at the data coming in and out of this mapper. So we can see that we have our calc status coming from Workday. And if we are expanding this, we can see that the status is closed and closed and open and closed. So here's an example of where the rec was very old. Workday said it was open, but our business rule says it's closed. So we can see that's working correctly. Now, to drag this to the target is incredibly easy, of course. You just add the plus and you just drag it in and you give it a name here. And that is going to show up in your target as real status. We've seen the 6 different calculated fields. We got a sense for the relationships between them that you had to build out and all the arduous clicking that had to be done to get the status. Now let's have a look at how to do it in SnapLogic. In SnapLogic, the transformation language that you typically use is JavaScript. And this is good for you as a company who's looking to acquire talent, because JavaScript is the language of the web. And as you use a lot of traditional ETL tools, most of them have some proprietary language. If you're using MuleSoft, for example, you have to know MEL, the Mule expression language. Now they tried to move away with that with DataWeave 1.0. They didn't quite get there, so they came up with DataWeave 2.0. So now you have 3 different languages that you have to learn. In their latest rendition of MuleSoft, they were saying that, good news guys, you only have to use DataWeave 2.0. But the fact is, as you're out there, you're going to see these different expression languages. Moreover, if you're using MuleSoft, in my experience, frankly, the platform forces you to use Java in places. It's very difficult to keep your Mule implementation clean. As I like to say, if you want to do so, it's possible, but you really must rule it with an iron fist. What I've done here is I've just wrote a little JavaScript. I'm taking today's date and I'm subtracting 365 days. And if that is greater than recruiting start date and the requisition is open, I need to flip to close, otherwise I need to retain the status. So let's go ahead and do a compare. Give this a name, save it, close it, and we'll validate this again. Coming back to the output, we can see we have the real status, which came from our Workday calculated fields, and we had the real status, which came from SnapLogic, and you can see that they match. So to recap, what I showed you here is, yes, you can do transformations in Workday. It certainly is possible. But from a level of effort perspective, it's certainly more difficult to do it in Workday. And this is also one of those places where the declarative versus programmatic argument kind of falls to pieces. Certainly, at the macro level, we want to do stuff declaratively. We want to drag snaps in, we don't want to configure them. However, when we're at the micro level, when we're actually doing implementations, if you have a choice between creating 6 different calculated fields and performing those 100+ clicks that you need to do the same thing that can be done with less than 100 characters of JavaScript, it makes more sense to use the JavaScript. And hopefully that resonates based on this demonstration. And last, but certainly not least, there are situations, of course, where you have an external system and Workday, but maybe you're not running your payroll out of Workday. Or perhaps the mechanism by which you initiate a payroll is outside of Workday, and that's what we're going to look at here. I have 2 simple pipelines here. One is submitting a payroll from an external system to Workday, and the second is reading that payroll from Workday to verify that it's in place. One thing to notice about this, if I pull in a Workday read, there is no input here. However, I can very easily add the input, and that's what I've done in this pipeline down below. I pulled in the Workday read, I've specified the get payroll operation, and I added an input. And this is a very powerful feature. In the case of Workday, it's going to let you get to the inputs of the web service, and I'll show you that in a moment. But it also shows up in places where you wouldn't expect. One of my favorite places is the output of a database write. In SnapLogic, you can actually define an output on a database write that's going to return a binary JSON document that's going to show you the errors and the failures and the successes. So there's major implications there for error handling, of course, but with the successes, you don't have to write and then read what you just wrote, which is an unfortunate pattern that you're forced to do with some integration tools. With SnapLogic, a couple clicks, you get your response back to the pipeline, and you can handle your downstream processing from there. Let's go ahead and configure this real quick. My get payroll is always going to operate. My put payroll, I'm not going to operate. So let's go ahead and validate that right now. And before we look at the results, let's have a look at what defining that input view gave us. So here you can see that we now have access to the inputs of the operation. We can specify the version, we can specify filtering information, and of course we can specify request criteria, which is what I've done here. And if we look at the results, we have an employee that has two $100 amounts for the payroll starting the 1st and ending the 8th of May. Our next step is to go ahead and configure this put payroll to execute during preview. And our external payroll in this case is a mock-up. We're doing something very similar to what you've seen in the results. Let's go ahead and run this and examine our response. Another benefit of SnapLogic, all the responses are actionable. You can pull them into your pipeline and do whatever you need with them. In this case, a very, very common integration pattern is keeping identifiers in sync. Workday replies with the identifier. SnapLogic returns the reply to the pipeline. You have your identifier. There's nothing else to do. It also includes the original, which is useful, of course. And it looks like this went through successfully. So let's validate it again and make sure we get it auto response. We'll just go ahead and disable this and do another validation. And if we take a look at our results, sure enough, we see the 3rd payroll entry. So to recap, SnapLogic gives you a lot of options with the payloads on the inputs and the outputs. And what we've done here is we've taken something that in Workday is really one of their core business processes and really one of the most complicated things that you can do. There's entire certifications that center around the concept of doing payroll in Workday. But what we've demonstrated here is that even that complex business process is possible with SnapLogic. Further, we've also demonstrated an end-to-end. Certainly this has all been contained within this pipeline, but it's not hard to imagine an input coming from an ERP to run the payroll and the output from that payroll going to some reporting database. And so concludes the demonstration. I do thank you for your time and your attention.